Hello and welcome to Motors and Medicine. On today's episode, I'm going to be discussing blood pressure and its implications on us as people, what exactly blood pressure is, how it affects us, and what we can do about it, both from a simple perspective and, of course, more advanced treatments. First off, what is blood pressure? Well, I like to explain it to my patients in this way because I see a lot of patients with blood pressure issues on a daily basis. The way I approach it is this: your heart is a pump, and your vasculature, specifically your arteries, are your vessels, and basically they act as your plumbing. So I kind of think of it like that. You got a pump and you got plumbing. So the pump exerts a certain amount of pressure on the vasculature or the arteries, and the resistance that it meets is what creates the pressure. So blood pressure, you have a top number or a systolic number, and then you have a bottom number, which is a diastolic number. Now, the systolic number is comprised of the pressure or the force exerted from the ventricles, which is the lower part of the heart. That's the part of the heart that pumps to the body, and of course to the lungs to get oxygenated. But primarily, it's the force exerted on the vasculature itself. And if you have, say, some heart issues, an enlarged heart, perhaps an arrhythmia, your heart itself, the pump itself is not going to work like it should. It might work too hard, might not work hard enough. That's going to affect your pressure. On the flip side, you've got vasculature. Now, if you have, say, peripheral artery disease, or if you have elevated cholesterol, you have plaque in your arteries, that is going to narrow your vasculature, narrow the arteries themselves, and make blood pressure increase because the resistance is increased, okay? So again, your heart's a pump, and if it's pumping against more resistance, then pressure is going to go up. So that's blood pressure in a nutshell. Now, how does it affect us? What are the implications on us physically? Well, if you think of it like this, those arteries in your body are coursing through every major organ. We like to call it the end organ, or the important, internal parts of our body, right? Well, those arteries get really small in those organs. And if you have either a heart that's working too hard, or you've got vessels that are clogged, for example, and you've got a lot of increase in blood pressure, that pressure exerted on those organs is going to cause damage to those organs because they're not designed to deal with that kind of pressure on a regular basis. So one example is, of course, your kidneys. Now, if kidneys get a pounding from elevated blood pressure on a regular basis, you're going to start having problems with kidney function. You'll start spilling protein in your urine, and the kidneys themselves will start to have issues with how they filter. Other organs in the body, the same thing. Eyes, pancreas, liver, doesn't matter what it is. If you have elevated blood pressure, those end organs are getting pounded on a regular basis. And you can still function. Your body learns to adapt and function with elevated blood pressure. But the negative ramifications start to add up, and you start to have some major impacts on end organ function. So what can we do about blood pressure? Well, let's first discuss blood pressure and its causes. Well, first off, the vast majority of blood pressure, I'd say between 80 and 85% of blood pressure issues, stem from genetics. So unfortunately, if you have a first-degree relative, parent, sibling that had blood pressure issues, you are very likely to have those same blood pressure issues. Blood pressure runs in the family, so it's a genetic problem. If you start to notice things like you go to a grocery store and do a blood pressure reading, or you on a regular basis are seeing your healthcare provider for regular checkups, and you start to notice a trend in blood pressure, and then you've got some family members that also had that same trend, well, you may very well have elevated blood pressure, hypertension. There are various stages of hypertension. Generally speaking, it starts off kind of at a low level, and then it starts to creep up from there. In general, we like to see blood pressure on the systolic side, or the top number, be around 130 or less for most people, and about 70 to 80 or less on the diastolic. Once you get to above 140 on the systolic, above 90 on the diastolic, then you start to get into, blood pressure elevations that, may start to impact end organ function, and you can start having some issues with your overall health. So there are ways, obviously, to manage blood pressure. Once you've established whether you've got a genetic component to it, you can obviously talk to your doctor about how to best manage this blood pressure. However, most people can affect their blood pressure in a positive way through diet and lifestyle. And so let's first talk about diet. Quite simply, diet, if you try to follow a diet that's a little bit healthier, and that can be construed in a number of ways, but it's primarily avoiding high fatty foods, high triglycerides, and foods that are highly processed and have a lot of salt or sodium. Sodium and salt really change how your vasculature, or how your arteries and your vessels behave. And they affect the elasticity of those vessels, and of course are going to affect the pressure, because your heart ends up pumping against more resistance. And that's one of those things that salt does. So one thing that we try to tell our patients is to avoid a lot of excessive salt, avoid a lot of sodium. And the thing is that in our American diet, we don't realize how much salt and sodium we're getting. So one thing I try to tell my patients is look at your foods that you buy. Write down in a journal what you eat for a day or a week, and then look at it and start to figure out, oh my gosh, I'm eating way too much sodium. You don't realize it. Sometimes you try to be healthy and think, okay, I'm just going to have maybe some soup or something. Well, soup is great, but it has a lot of sodium. A lot of processed foods that you find at the grocery store have sodium, too much sodium. And that sodium will inherently affect your blood pressure in a negative way. The other thing that might affect your blood pressure is if you're taking too many type of stimulants, like caffeine, for example. Everybody loves to be alert and awake, oriented, if you will, especially at the beginning of the day. But if you take too much of those stimulants, you will start to have an impact on your blood pressure as well, even if it's just for the short-term period. But if in that short-term period, those organs were overexerted, well, now you're going to have, if you compile that over time, you'll start to see some end organ damage. For example, if you drink, 1 cup of coffee a day, not really a big deal, but there are people who drink numerous cups of coffee, or numerous Red Bulls, or Rockstars, or Monsters. Even 5-hour energies are excessive. Now, I actually use, 5-hour on occasion myself, but I never drink the entire bottle. Generally, I might have maybe about a teaspoon worth of a 5-hour. And that little shot of amino acids and B vitamins helps kind of give you an energy boost. It also helps with your mood, but it's not necessarily going to help, increase your blood pressure too much or for too long a period. So that's something to keep in mind. You just want to try to keep your diet at the forefront. And so try to keep your salt down, try to keep those stimulants down as much as possible, and then try to eat foods that are going to help reduce blood pressure. And there's a lot of foods out there that'll help reduce blood pressure. Some fruits do it. Pomegranate is a really good example. Eating a lot of pomegranate will help reduce blood pressure. Eating foods like avocados will help bring your cholesterol down. So these are simple things that you can do. You just need to research what foods will help bring down those numbers, and you can achieve pretty decent blood pressure decreases with just dietary changes alone. Now we can look at lifestyle. And by lifestyle, I mean primarily just being active. Just be active. Some people work in jobs that require that you are sedentary most of the day. Well, you're going to have to break that cycle, get up, move around. At least once an hour, you got to get up and move around. And if you can be active on a daily basis, even as little as walking 10 to 15 minutes a day as part of your routine, it really reduces the impact on blood pressure. Now, there are obviously some people that are going to have extremely highly elevated blood pressure readings and numbers, and those people need to see their primary care providers and be evaluated and figure out what type of approach is going to be best. Obviously, dietary changes, lifestyle changes are always the initial approach, but blood pressure does need to be managed. You just don't want to see your numbers creep up too high. Once they do, then you start to see that end organ damage, and you start to end up with those unwanted health concerns later on down the road. So ideally, the purpose of this video was just to kind of give you an introduction of what blood pressure is, how it's measured. Now, typically, when you get it measured, it's either done by a machine or a cuff in the blood in the doctor's office, and that's probably the most accurate way. I don't advise you follow your blood pressure with a wrist measurement cuff. And it's okay if you go to the grocery store. They're not super accurate, but you'll at least see a trend. So what I tell my patients is if you're having issues with blood pressure, whether it's known or not, just write down, go, whether it's to your doctor's office or if you're just going to the grocery store, or if you buy a cuff and you do it at home, try to find a cuff that measures on your upper arm, and that's going to be a little bit more accurate. But primarily, it's writing down the blood pressure on a daily basis. Write down those numbers and just keep track. It's just like you keep track of many other things in your life. Keep track of your blood pressure. Blood pressure is one of those things that people tend to ignore, and it is a silent killer. It kills a lot of people in this country. So it's good to be aware of that. We all want to have longevity in our lives. So just pay attention to what your blood pressure is doing. Write down in your journal if not once or twice a week, at least a few times a month, so that you can kind of see what's going on. Pay attention to those dietary changes, those lifestyle changes, those foods that'll impact your blood pressure, and you'll be in good shape. So I hope that this video brought you guys some good information. And like always, I ask you to please like and subscribe. It helps my channel grow. And I will see you guys in the next episode. We'll get back into the cars and see what we do at that point. And this is Motors and Medicine signing off. Have a great one.